Tonight, we begin with a diplomatic moment that didn't arrive with an announcement, a press release, or a formal declaration. It arrived with silence. A silence so sudden, so complete, that intelligence officials in Washington, Brussels, and several European capitals immediately knew something was wrong. Not weeks of negotiation, not months of shuttle diplomacy, just 48 hours. 48 hours that shifted the tone of this war. 48 hours that forced urgent calls between allies. 48 hours that pushed Ukraine's president toward a decision he could not afford to delay. For nearly 3 years, this conflict has followed a grim but familiar rhythm. Russian pressure, Ukrainian resistance, Western support, escalation, adaptation, repetition. Analysts learned to recognize the patterns. Moscow's threats would rise before major offensives. State media rhetoric would harden. Troop movements would spike. Putin would speak often carefully, strategically, always signaling strength. But then, early this week, something broke that pattern. The signals didn't escalate, they vanished. Russian military communications slowed. Public messaging from the Kremlin flattened. Senior figures who normally flooded state television went quiet. Even Vladimir Putin's public schedule, usually a carefully choreographed display of confidence, suddenly emptied. To most people, silence looks like nothing. To intelligence analysts, silence is a warning. Because when Vladimir Putin stops signaling, it usually means one of two things. Either Russia is preparing to strike, or Russia is preparing to shift. And this time, it wasn't a strike. By late Monday, Western intelligence agencies began circulating internal assessments describing what they called unusual diplomatic indicators, not statements, not speeches. Not proposals delivered through official channels, just movement discreet, indirect, and deliberately ambiguous. Back-channel feelers. Third-party intermediaries. Communications patterns that hadn't been observed in over a year. Nothing public, nothing confirmable. But enough to set off alarms. Because for 3 years, Vladimir Putin has refused to negotiate unless Ukraine surrendered first. His demands were absolute. Ukraine must give up territory. NATO must retreat. The West must accept Russia's vision of a rewritten European order. Every previous peace proposal collapsed because it was never designed to succeed. They were pressure tactics, not compromises. That's why diplomats were skeptical when whispers began circulating that Moscow's posture had changed. They had seen this movie before. False openings, performative diplomacy, offers designed to fracture Western unity rather than end the war. But this time, something felt different. The signals weren't coming from Russia's foreign ministry. They weren't coming from state media. They weren't coming from negotiators tasked with buying time. They appeared to be coming from the Kremlin itself. And that's when Washington started paying very close attention. By Tuesday morning, emergency consultations were already underway inside the White House. Senior officials were briefed on what intelligence analysts described as a potential shift, not yet a proposal, not yet an offer, but a recalibration. Something Moscow was testing quietly before deciding whether to make it visible. The word being used behind closed doors wasn't peace. It was probe, a test, a way to measure how the West would react after the U.S. election. A way to see whether unity still held. A way to find out who might blink first. And at the center of that calculation was Ukraine. Because if Russia was about to float something that looked like de-escalation even temporarily, the pressure wouldn't fall on Moscow. It would fall on Kyiv, it would fall on NATO, and it would fall on an incoming American administration that had promised change. That's why the next move mattered so much. By Wednesday afternoon, through intermediaries, whose identities remained deliberately obscured, what appeared to be a structured concept began taking shape. Not a treaty, not a settlement. Something far more dangerous in its simplicity. A pause. A temporary halt. A framework. A window, not officially announced. Not publicly confirmed, but specific enough to trigger a response. According to multiple diplomatic sources, the outline being discussed involved a limited cessation of offensive operations along current lines, humanitarian access in contested zones, and renewed discussions about the future of occupied territories, discussions that had been frozen since the earliest months of the war. No guarantees, no recognition, no final borders, just time. And time, in this war, is never neutral. For Ukraine, time can mean survival or vulnerability. For Russia, time can mean regrouping or recalculation. For the West, time can mean diplomacy or division. When word of this possible opening reached President Volodymyr Zelensky, he understood the danger immediately, not just the military implications, but the political ones. Because if this moment unfolded without Ukraine shaping it, others would. He could wait, or he could move. He chose to move, fast. Within hours, Zelensky convened his senior leadership in Kiev. Calls went out to Washington, London, Berlin, and Paris. Not to celebrate, not to endorse, but to warn. Because this wasn't about whether a pause might happen. This was about who would define what that pause meant. And somewhere in Florida, another figure was preparing to step back onto the world stage with promises of ending this war quickly. Zelensky knew something else, too. In moments like this, silence is filled by whoever speaks first. So he refused to stay silent. By the time Zelensky's plane lifted off, the diplomatic clock was already ticking. This wasn't a routine visit. There were no prepared talking points, no scheduled press appearances, no carefully staged photo opportunities designed to project calm. This was an emergency maneuver, executed at speed, under pressure, with the full understanding that delay itself could be fatal. Because in modern war, perception moves faster than tanks. Zelensky knew that the moment any hint of a ceasefire entered the global conversation, three things would happen immediately. First, allies would start asking whether continued military aid was still necessary. Second, critics would argue Ukraine should accept whatever deal was on the table. And third, Russia would attempt to frame itself as the reasonable actor, the side suddenly open to peace. That narrative, once established, is almost impossible to reverse. So Zelensky didn't wait for formal invitations. He didn't wait for coordinated statements from Europe. And he didn't wait for Washington to decide how to respond. Instead, he moved directly to the one place where the next phase of this war might be decided, the incoming American political center of gravity, Florida. The decision to go was not without risk. Zelensky was stepping into a political transition period where messaging was fluid, authority was shifting, and commitments were being reassessed. But that uncertainty was precisely why the trip mattered. If Ukraine wasn't present at the table when the conversation started, it might not be invited later. Sources familiar with the situation say that by the time Zelensky arrived, the mood inside U.S. political circles was tense and divided. On one side were officials warning that any pause without binding guarantees could hand Russia a strategic reset. On the other were voices arguing that even a temporary halt in fighting deserved serious consideration after years of bloodshed. Hovering over all of it was Donald Trump. Trump had campaigned on a promise to end the war quickly. He had criticized the scale of U.S. support. He had hinted that negotiation, not escalation, was the answer. But what that actually meant in practice remained undefined. Zelensky needed clarity, and more importantly, he needed influence. The meeting itself was deliberately low profile. No advance notice, no press pool, no official readout. Just two leaders, a handful of advisors, and hours of closed-door discussion focused on one central question. If Russia is signaling a pause, what happens next? According to officials briefed on the conversation, the discussion revolved around three core issues. First, the nature of Russia's move. Was Moscow genuinely seeking de-escalation, or was this an attempt to freeze the conflict on favorable terms? Zelensky reportedly made his position clear. Ukraine would not reject dialogue, but it would not accept ambiguity that allows Russia to regroup. Second, America's role. Trump has repeatedly suggested he could negotiate directly with Putin. Zelensky needed to know whether Ukraine would be part of that process or simply the subject of it. Any settlement negotiated without Kyiv's direct involvement would be unacceptable. Third, security guarantees. This was the non-negotiable issue. Zelensky understands the history. Every pause Russia has used in the past has been followed by renewed aggression. Without binding guarantees, a ceasefire becomes a trap. Sources describe the exchange as blunt, candid, and at times uncomfortable. Zelensky pressed for commitments, Trump pressed for flexibility, but both sides reportedly agreed on a critical point. Any Russian proposal must be tested, not trusted. Because a real ceasefire saves lives, and a fake one costs them later. What made Zelensky's move remarkable wasn't just its speed, it was its timing. While European leaders were still consulting internally, Ukraine had already engaged the next American administration directly. That alone reshaped the diplomatic landscape. Moscow noticed. Western intelligence officials monitoring Russian responses observed a shift in tone within hours. The Kremlin had expected hesitation. It had expected debate. It had expected division. Instead, it saw coordination and a Ukrainian president acting with confidence rather than desperation. That mattered. Because Russia's strategy in this phase wasn't about tanks or missiles. It was about leverage. It was about seeing who would push Ukraine toward compromise and who would stand firm. Zelensky's move disrupted that plan. By Thursday, European capitals began aligning their messaging. Statements of support came faster than expected. NATO officials adjusted their public posture, emphasizing that no pause could come at the expense of Ukrainian sovereignty. Behind the scenes, emergency consultations replaced routine scheduling. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Ukraine was not isolated. And that created a problem for Putin, because this moment was supposed to expose cracks. Instead, it revealed cohesion. Analysts now believe the Kremlin's silence earlier in the week wasn't a sign of confidence, but caution. Russia is under pressure militarily, economically, and politically. Sanctions continue to bite. Casualties continue to mount. Resources continue to stretch. And internal debates inside Moscow are growing louder. Hardliners want escalation. Pragmatists want stability. Elites want relief. Putin is balancing all of it while facing a war he expected to win in days and is now approaching its fourth year. That context makes this moment dangerous. Not because peace is close, but because miscalculation is. A pause that favors Russia would lock in territorial gains. A pause without guarantees would give Moscow time to rearm. A pause framed as Ukrainian weakness would erode Western support. Zelensky understands that better than anyone, which is why his message, both publicly and privately, has remained consistent. Ukraine is willing to talk, but not willing to freeze the war on Russia's terms. And that brings us to the critical question now hanging over this conflict. Is this the beginning of the end, or the beginning of the most volatile phase yet? Because wars don't always end with surrender. Sometimes they end with silence, followed by something much louder. If there is one lesson history teaches us about modern wars, it is this. The most dangerous moment is not when the fighting is at its worst. It is when the fighting appears to slow. That is where this conflict now stands. Because what Vladimir Putin is signaling is not surrender, and it is not peace. It is pressure redirected, refined, and deployed in a form far more difficult to counter than missiles or tanks. Inside Moscow, the strain of this war is impossible to hide. Russian military commanders are facing equipment shortages, exhausted units, and casualty figures that continue to climb. Sanctions have not collapsed the economy, but they have reshaped it in painful ways. Elite access to Western markets has evaporated. Assets remain frozen. Long-term growth prospects are narrowing. At the same time, domestic expectations are diverging. Hardliners believe escalation is the answer. They argue that Russia must strike harder, mobilize further, and force an outcome before Western patience hardens into permanent containment. Pragmatists argue the opposite. They see a prolonged war draining Russia's future, not securing it. They want stabilization, relief, and time. Putin stands between these forces. And that is why any ceasefire signal must be understood for what it really is. A balancing act. Not a concession. Not a breakthrough. A calculation. From the Kremlin's perspective, a pause offers multiple advantages. It tests Western unity. It places political pressure on Ukraine. It opens the door to negotiations where battlefield realities can be translated into diplomatic leverage. And it buys time to reorganize, rearm, and reassess. That is why Zelensky has been so careful. Because Ukraine has seen this before. In 2014, in 2015, in every frozen conflict Russia has touched. A ceasefire without enforcement becomes a holding pattern. A pause without guarantees becomes a reset for the aggressor. A negotiation without leverage becomes a trap. This is why Zelensky's message to allies has been so disciplined. Ukraine is not rejecting diplomacy. It is rejecting illusion. And that distinction matters. Behind closed doors, Western officials are now grappling with a reality they had hoped to avoid. The war is entering a phase where military logic and political logic begin to diverge. On the battlefield, momentum shifts slowly. In diplomacy, it can shift overnight. Public opinion plays a role. Election cycles play a role. Fatigue plays a role. Putin knows this. That is why timing matters so much. This move did not come during peak escalation. It came during transition, political transition in the United States, strategic transition in Europe, and operational transition on the battlefield. In other words, the moment when resolve is most likely to be tested. Zelensky's rapid response was designed to deny Moscow that advantage. By engaging early, directly, and assertively, he reframed the conversation. This is not about Ukraine being pressured into compromise. It is about Ukraine setting the conditions under which compromise might even be discussed. That shift is subtle but powerful. It tells allies that Kyiv is not clinging to endless war, nor is it racing toward premature peace. It is positioning itself as a rational actor with clear red lines and strategic patience. And it complicates Moscow's plans. Because Russia's greatest diplomatic weapon has always been Western division. When that division fails to appear, pressure flows back toward the Kremlin instead. That is what we are seeing now. European governments, after initial caution, have moved quickly to reinforce unity. NATO officials have emphasized that no ceasefire can undermine Ukraine's sovereignty. Military aid continues. Intelligence sharing remains active. The message, carefully worded but unmistakable, is that Ukraine will not be left alone at the negotiating table. And that leaves Putin with fewer options than he appears to have. Escalation carries risks. Stagnation carries costs. And compromise carries internal consequences. This is the bind of long wars. The leader who starts them often discovers that ending them is far more complex. What happens next will not be decided in a single meeting, a single proposal, or a single announcement. It will unfold over weeks, perhaps months, in the gray space between fighting and talking. The next 90 days matter. Not because a final deal is imminent, but because narratives will solidify, positions will harden, expectations will be set. And once those expectations take root, they shape outcomes long before signatures are placed on paper. If Russia pushes too far, it risks renewed escalation. If the West pushes too little, it risks legitimizing aggression. If Ukraine miscalculates, it risks losing leverage it has fought to preserve. That is why this moment feels so unstable. Not because peace is near, but because the war has reached a point where mistakes carry generational consequences. Putin is no longer fighting the war he planned. Zelensky is no longer leading the country Russia expected to face. And the West is no longer the fractured alliance Moscow hoped to exploit. A ceasefire offer, real or not, does not change that reality. What it changes is the battlefield of decision-making. And tonight, that battlefield is not in eastern Ukraine. It is in conference rooms, in intelligence briefings, in private conversations where words carry more weight than weapons. The silence that started this week was not empty. It was loaded. And what comes after silence, as history has shown us again and again, is never quiet.